Welcome back, everyone. This is Ayad Boudiab, and we are continuing our directives discussion in AngularJS. In the previous video, I showed you how we can work with one-way binding, right? We saw the different examples in here. We get books.length, we bind. We use the ng bind as well. And then also we saw how we can work with the non-bindable and the bind template as we've seen in this lesson. Now in today's lesson, I need to talk about the two-way binding, and then we'll expand on that as we proceed. When we talk about two-way binding, when we say two ways, we have the elements in the scope, and then they bind to some controls on the page. So now, which pretty much the view, right? And now when I'm working in the view and I made some changes, they should be reflected in the model, right? Which is in this case the part of the scope. So then when I say when things change, what do I mean? I mean we're talking about input box or a text area or a select element, right? So the user will be able to interact, type something, and then some events will be hooked for us behind the scene that reflects those changes on the other parts of the page. Okay, so let's see how we can do this. I'm going to use the same example regarding the books, right? So let's take a quick look at that before I proceed. And I'm going to paste that on the screen right now. We use the reference to the AngularJS within the scripts folder. We've seen this. It's part of the within the same page. I mean within the same folder structure. And then I have linked to the Bootstrap CSS and Bootstrap theme CSS. I have a script that declares a module named directive app that does not depend on any other dependency. That's why the array is empty. And then I tag to it .controller because I can chain my calls. And then I built a controller called basic controller, and then I added the books array to the scope. I passed in the scope in here, and then I tagged in that books array to the scope. This is called directive app. So I have to go up to my HTML and say ng-app equals directive app. Oops, sorry. Right? So now I have the app as part of the page, which is the module, right? The directive app. And I also have the actual basic controller that's in here. From my previous example, I created a div, right? That div contains some of the elements that I need. So I'm going to paste that here in the body. I don't need these here. So now I have the div, which is a panel. Again, these panel classes, you can find them in Bootstrap with a panel header. The controller is the basic controller. That's the basic controller you saw here. And then right now it just says my books list. Go ahead and save. And then copy full path or the file path. Come here, paste it, just to simply make sure that we have things in order. Looks good, looks styled correctly, so Bootstrap is working. Nothing right now to show, so far so good. Okay. Now after the H3, I need to add some of the two-way binding stuff that I was talking about, right? Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to go here and create a div. And then inside that div that I have here, I'm going to put some two-way binding stuff. I'm going to show a form because I need to give a label and a place for the user to enter their input information, so a text box, right? And the way I do this within Bootstrap is by using class equals form group because it's part of form, right? So that's why we use form group in this case. Again, need more details about Bootstrap, we can reference the Bootstrap page, but that's not our discussion here. The concentration is on Angular, right? So I have class, which is the form group. I need to introduce a label and an input box. Label. And then in this label, I'm going to use first book. And then underneath it, I'm going to enter an input box. And in here, where I'm going to give it a name equal first book. And then I'm going to give it a class, that's the CSS class, and that will be equal to the form control. Again, that's part of the form, so I use form control here. And then I'm going to use the two-way binding. The way we do two-way binding in Angular is by using the ng model. Okay. By the way, I think I mentioned something here by mistake. I was saying two-way binding by using these. It's just this is the one-way binding, right, that we're talking about in here. So this concept in here is all about the one-way binding. I'm sorry if I misled you in the previous discussion. Now that I remember it, I'm using here one-way binding, and in here I'm using the two-way binding by using the ng model. Okay, so in the ng model, I'm going to indicate what elements I'm referring to. So in this case, I remember that I have the books array coming in part of the scope, right, that's available to me. I'm going to use sub-0 because I'm referring to the first book, and then I'm going to use .name because this is the property of that book. So book sub-0 .name, that's part of this input element. I'm going to introduce another very similar input element, and this one will also work with the page count. Okay, so underneath this one, this is the first div containing the form group with the label and the input box, and then underneath it I'm going to introduce another class form group with a label that's last book page count. It refers to this input name last book, class form control, and notice the ng model, it says books sub 4, which is the last one, dot page count to display the page count. Notice in here that we can use the 4 for the label to tell which input box is referring to. I missed that over here, so I can introduce that to this label by saying 4 equals, and then in here I can say first book. It's for first book. So put that over here, this HTML5 stuff. So the label is first book, that's for first book input box. Last book, the last book input box, but I'm talking about in here the page count for the last book. Okay, let's go ahead and save. Bring that over here. Reload. It says first book, JavaScript made easy. It already bound to that. And then the last book page count is 423. This is the last book page count is 423. And the first book is JavaScript made easy, like it showed me. And that's one thing, by the way, that's interesting about this page. Notice how it's bootstrapped. So now, if I minimize or maximize the size, it just works very well. I don't have to lose control of where the controls are, right? It fits an iPad, it fits an iPhone, and so on. Okay, so that's why I see that I can say that Bootstrap is really interesting to work with in conjunction with HTML5 and AngularJS. All right, let's take this a step further to see what we're talking about as far as the two-way binding is concerned. So let's go over here. This is the third one down here. And let's introduce one-way binding in this case. So I'm going to say div. And in that div, I'm going to say the last book pages are, and here I'm going to add the one-way binding. Remember the one-way binding that we had from previous discussion? We can use the ng bind, right? So I'm going to introduce a span in here, and I'm going to close the span, and then inside the span I'm going to use ng dash bind and then equals is the content. Notice in here that I said I'm introducing a span within the div, because when I use ngBind, it's going to replace that span with the content. If I don't introduce that span, I use ngBind, the whole div would be replaced with the content. That's not what I want. I want only this piece to be replaced with the actual content. That's why I introduced a span within the div. Okay. Now what are we binding to? ngBind equal, I'm going to also again looks at books sub 4, that's the last one, and then dot page count. Now let's go back here and reload the page. It says the last book has pages are 423, and that's the main concept that I'm trying to illustrate as far as two-way binding is concerned. What's going to happen when I change this guy? Well, if I change this is using two-way binding, right? This is the input box in here. It's using ng model, therefore two-way binding. If I change the model, the actual data within the scope will change. But then this last div here is binding to that data. So that change should be reflected in that last div. So if I go over here and instead of 423 I would say 123 or 1234, notice that the last one in here has changed to 1234. Why? Because again it was binding to that data. It was using one-way binding here, but this was using two-way binding. Since this has affected the data, changed the data, and the last div is mapping to that data, now the last div will reflect the change as well. So you see the importance of two-way binding and how we can work that with that through, for example, a text box, text area, select from select elements, and so on. So as you can see, it is really important to work with one-way binding, two-way binding, different way of binding, how we can work with an unbindable option, right? As I discussed with you before. Let's take a quick summary of what we've done. We learned that we can use one-way binding using ngBind. But in day-to-day applications, in your regular applications, building building Angular applications, you don't see this one as much. This one-way binding, you don't see it as much. You see this way of one-way binding instead. So this is the one-way binding that we can work with. And this is more favorable than this one. Okay? This is the one-way binding. But then, with the ng model, I can do the two-way binding. In the case of two-way binding, it relies on input elements like the input box or the text area. When the data changes in the text area, AngularJS behind the scene hooks up all the events for us so we can reflect, so because it's two-way binding, the data changes are reflected here. Now, since other elements within the page are bound to that data in the array, the change will be reflected here as well. Now, if you need to use a template to show your data, you can use ngBind template to show different sets of data like you do here. But again, if you're working with a different library other than AngularJS, and that library is using the curly braces, you could kind of turn off the binding by saying ng non-bindable directive, and now it doesn't bind the content like I showed you earlier. Now we can introduce the other library's content here, and it will not interfere because AngularJS will not try to bind those elements for you. So this is right now how we can work with one-way binding and two-way binding and so on. Now I'm going to move to another, still talking more about directives, but I need to see how we can work with that in tables and so on. We'll dig deeper into directives and see how we can work with them. So please stay tuned for the upcoming video. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ayad Boudiab, and you have a good day.